Hi, guys. Welcome to your Cold War unit. We're going to launch the Cold War unit today by talking about the origins. So, how it begun, the history, how did we get where we are? Um, the Cold War is the name given to the rocky relationship and a battle of political philosophies mainly between the United States and the Soviet Union after World War II. And I kind of alluded that this was going to happen when on our World War II unit. So the Cold War was not fought head to head between the Soviet Union and the United States, but it was actually fought through other countries and through other events, such as like the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Korean conflict, the Vietnam War, Hungary, and the Berlin Wall are just some of the things we're going to talk about. For many, the growth in weapons of mass of in ma- of bleh, the growth in weapons of mass destruction, that's a tongue twister for me apparently, or nuclear weapons during this time was the scariest issue because it was just not known. The superpowers used spying and propaganda and diplomacy and secret operations in their dealings with each other. So there wasn't a lot of trust. Much of the world allied with either one side of the or the other. In fact, until the Soviet Union finally broke up in 1991, the Cold War dictated not only US and Soviet foreign policy, but it also influenced world alliances as well. So, the history of the US and the Soviet Union has been rocky from the start. The United States wouldn't even recognize the Soviet Union as a country in 1917. It wouldn't be until 1933 that the US finally would. But even during the war as allies, the US and Britain were upset that Stalin would enter a non-aggression pact with Hitler. And Stalin was upset that the Allies had not invaded Europe sooner to take the pressure off the Russian front. So all of this dates back to the actions that each of the countries chose during World War II, which, by the way, is now over when we're talking about this. But by the end of the war, relations between the Russians and the other Eastern European country or the Western European countries has really gone sour. And if you'll remember, the United States they chose to drop a nuclear bomb as opposed to involving the Russians to help them out in Japan. So the United States just did not want the help of the Russians. So the Cold War would be fought in Poland, Germany, Korea, and Vietnam. It would be fought in Afghanistan and in countries throughout Central and South America, but it would never be directly fought between the US and the Soviet Union, in part for fear of an all out global nuclear war destroying not just the two countries involved, but the whole world. So I want to take you back to before the war ended and the Yalta Conference. So you remember me talking about the Yalta Conference and the post-war plan. So I'm going to remind you of this because this is really important moving forward. The war wasn't over in February 1945, but the leaders of the United States, Britain, Soviet Union, all met at the Soviet Black Sea resort of Yalta. And there, remember, they agreed to divide Germany into zones of occupation, each one controlled by Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union, and France. And you're going to see the Soviet Union represented as the USSR. And USSR actually stands for United Soviet Socialist Republic. And so it was referred to the USSR. You'll hear me call it the Soviet Union just out of habit. So they said that they were going to split Germany into the 4 zones. They were going to split Berlin the same way. And remember, I showed you that graphic that Berlin was actually going to be in the middle of the Soviet occupied part of Germany. Stalin was supposed to allow elections in nations of Eastern Europe. And then the last thing was Stalin was agreed to join the war against Japan. So this is the graphic that I had showed you earlier about how Germany was divided up between France and Great Britain and the Soviet Union and the United States. So just a little back history. Now, the United Nations was created in June of 1945. And the United States and the Soviet Union temporarily, and I say temporarily loosely, they set aside their differences and they joined 48 other countries in forming the United Nations, or you might hear it called today the UN. And this international organization was intended to protect the members of the organization against aggression, so against attack. It was to be based in New York, and the charter for the new peacekeeping organization established a large body called the General Assembly, and there each UN member nation could cast its vote on a broad range of issues. An 11-member body called the Security Council had the real power to investigate and settle disputes, though. So you can see what they're doing is they're trying to add some outside influence and some perspectives that are kind of removed from the situation. Its 5 permanent members were Britain, China, France, the United States, and the Soviet Union. They were permanent members. Each could veto, meaning get rid of, any Security Council action. This provision was intended to prevent any members of the council from voting as a bloc to override the others. And so that was more of a strategic purpose. So although the US and the Soviet had agreements in Yalta and were on the Security Council together, they still split after the war. The war had affected each of them very differently. The United States was the world's richest and most powerful country, and they suffered 400,000 deaths. The Soviets suffered 50 million. So 1 in 4 Soviets was either wounded or killed. And the US still had their cities and factories, because if you'll remember, there wasn't none of World War II took place on the mainland of the US. The only attack on the US was on the island of Hawaii. So all of the industry and things that made the United States wealthy, they weren't destroyed like the rest of Europe. So many Soviet cities, though, were demolished because remember, the Germans bombed them, and they destroyed a lot of the Soviet Union cities. So these 2 differing situations, as well as the political and economic differences, affected each of the 2 countries' goals. Okay, so Eastern Europe was primarily, well, let's start with this. A major goal of the Soviet Union was to shield itself from another invasion from Western Europe. Okay, so centuries of history, we learn a lot from the history, had taught Soviets to be afraid of invasion. During the 17th century, which was the 1800s, the Poles had captured Russia. And during the next century, the Swedes attacked. And so Napoleon overran Moscow in 1812. So the Germans invaded Russia during World War I and II. So Stalin needed strong and friendly border nations to kind of separate the Soviet Union from Western Europe to ensure there would never be another invasion on the mother country, because they were really worried, that they wanted those other countries to come to buffer, to add as like a no man's land, a distance. Um, so during the final attacks on World War II, uh, on Germany during World War II, the Soviet troops pushed the Nazis back across Eastern Europe. And at the war's end, these troops actually occupied a strip of countries along the Soviet Union's own western border. Now, Stalin regarded these countries as a necessary buffer or a wall of protection. And he ignored the Yalta Agreement and installed communist governments in Albania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Poland, and Yugoslavia. So if you look, I'm gonna pull up, well, I was gonna try to pull up my, if you look right here, this light pink color, this is the area of the buffer zone that he kind of took over and pushed back. So Austria is right here, and I talked about Austria. Um, well, I talked about Yugoslavia, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, all of Poland, all of this area right here. The Soviet leader's American partner at Yalta was Franklin D. Roosevelt. Now, remember that Roosevelt died on April 12th, 1945, and Roosevelt's successor was Harry Truman. And Stalin's reluctance to allow free elections in these Eastern European nations was a clear violation of those countries' rights, in his opinion. And I gotta kind of agree. Truman, Stalin, and Churchill met at Potsdam, Germany in July of 1945. And there, Truman pressed Stalin to allow free elections in Eastern Europe. Stalin refused. He said in a speech in early 1946, he declared that communism and capitalism could not exist in the same world. And so the United States is a capitalist nation, and the Soviet Union is a communist nation. And so an iron curtain, we're going to learn where that phrase was coined, is going to divide Eastern and Western Europe. So Germany has now been split into two sections: Eastern Europe and Western Europe. East Germany and West Germany. So the Soviets controlled the eastern part, including half of the capital, which was Berlin. And under a communist government, East Germany was named the German Democratic Republic. Now, the Western zones became the Federal Republic of Germany in 1949. And Winston Churchill coined the phrase Iron Curtain in a speech. Iron Curtain came to represent Europe's division into a mostly democratic Western Europe and a communist Eastern Europe. Because if you'll remember, on past Europe and into Asia, China was also a communist country. So it's kind of everything past that line over became more communist nations. And so tomorrow, we're going to look a little more at some things that that will happen that also lay the foundation for the Cold War. So I will see more of you tomorrow.